we do have to take into account that we can be mistaken. So some perceptions are more real than others. I've spent a lot of my life consorting with people whose way of thinking about the world is pretty mistaken. And so it's not that all our perceptions are right, or all our intuitions are right, or all our reasoning is right. We can be deceived by anything. So that has to be put into the mix. Some things are realer than others, I think.
Howdy, this is Jim Rutt, and this is The Jim Rutt Show. This episode is one of a series I'm doing on the worldviews of thinkers and doers. The premise is simple. I want to map how they actually see the universe and their place in it, not just dig into their latest book or project, but explore the scaffolding underneath. Enjoy this opportunity to look backstage at the minds of some of my favorite people. It's been a while since I've nudged our listeners to give us a 5-star rating on your podcast app, but fresh ratings help us grow our audience, which help us to continue to attract our excellent guests. Even better, if you have the time, a short review helps even more. Thanks. Now, on to our show. Today's guest is Iain McGilchrist. Iain is a psychiatrist, philosopher, and literary scholar best known for his influential work on the divided brain and how it shapes culture and meaning. He's perhaps best known for his 2 books, The Master and His Emissary, and the 2-volume The Matter with Things. Iain is currently Chancellor of Ralston College and continues to write and speak worldwide on neuroscience, philosophy, and the nature of reality. He and I also share an interest in good single malt scotches. Welcome back, Iain.
Thank you very much, Jim. It's lovely to be back with you, yes. And don't forget to specify Talisker as the important one.
Yeah, Talisker 18. We both, Iain turned me on to that, and I go, I had tried Talisker 10. I went, man, it tastes like a cross between turpentine and city water. But Talisker 18, man, that's a delicious dram, I will say.
It is indeed. Thank you.
For those who want to go deeper into Iain's work, he and I did a 2-episode set, EP 154 and 155, on his 1,000+ page magnum opus, The Matter with Things. Or, of course, read the books so that the McGilchrist children can have shoes. All right, let me start where I usually start on this worldview series. Is you woke up this morning, and after a few seconds, there was someone named Iain McGilchrist that re-entered the world. What is this person who woke up, and what is the nature of the world that you woke up in?
Yeah, yes. How long do you want me to talk for on that one?
As long as you want. As long as you want. Open-ended.
Okay. It's a good question. And it invites discussion of 2 principal questions. One is, what does it mean to be a conscious being, and how does that conscious being relate to the cosmos at large? And they're interconnected, obviously. And so let's begin by talking about consciousness. What is it? It's impossible to describe in words because it is the basis of everything that we describe. And it is the only thing that we know absolutely certainly from experience, which is why it tickles me that presumably reasonably intelligent people still exist who go around denying the existence of consciousness, but never mind, let's leave them aside. So consciousness, yes. We know what that is, but what is matter? And a lot of physicists have made the point that people want to be able to reduce consciousness to matter. I mean, it's not something they'll ever succeed in doing, I would say. But they want to do that because they think that matter is at least something we understand. And physicists are very clear about the fact that matter is something very strange indeed. And the more they know about it, the stranger it gets. So it is not something that is transparently obvious what it is. But the one thing you can say is that matter is something that we know because we have consciousness. It's something that crops up in consciousness. Whether consciousness is somehow due to our being material beings, well, we can talk about that. But the one thing that is very clear is that matter is something we know because of consciousness, in consciousness, and through consciousness. I actually hold that matter is a phase of consciousness. And when I use the word phase, I don't mean a temporal phase. I mean a phase in the sense that physicists and chemists talk about the phases of a substance like water. And of course, in those different phases, one of them, it's transparent and it flows easily across your hand, and that's very familiar. But that in another phase, it's not transparent, it's opaque, it's extraordinarily hard, and it won't move until you shove it. And then in another phase, it's suspended in the room you're in, Jim, and in the room I'm in. Tons of it. And if it weren't for that, we wouldn't be here. So water is mysteriously different in different phases. And I think consciousness has different phases. What is the point of matter? Why should consciousness ever take the form of matter? I think, again, to cut a long story short, the reason is that matter provides two things that consciousness on its own doesn't seem to have. One is, and it may surprise people to learn that this is incredibly important for creativity, resistance. Nothing, I believe, comes into being without resistance. And, of course, we live in a world in which it seems obvious that resistance is something we ought to try and do away with. But, in fact, I don't think there'd be much of a life or of anything happening if there weren't for resistance. And the other is persistence. So in my mind, I can go wherever I like, and my thoughts, once they're finished, they disappear. But, absent a disaster, a hurricane, this table I'm setting out will be here tomorrow morning. So matter has those qualities which help the world, to help the cosmos differentiate. So I think the purpose or the point and the direction and the trajectory of the cosmos is into a differentiation which is always not threatening its integral nature. And that differentiation, once it's there, then becomes reintegrated and then unfolds again into a new differentiation. In saying this, I'm very much in line with a whole string of philosophers and physicists, I think particularly of Goethe, who said the whole business of nature is dividing the united, uniting the divided. And David Bohm, the physicist and philosopher, believed that the cosmos was originally implicate, everything was infolded, and it was in the process of explicating, unfolding, and showing itself, but that it went through phases in which that unfoldedness then became reinfolded and so on. So that's a little bit about what I think about consciousness and matter. Now, I'm a conscious material being. I believe you are too, Jim. And when I wake up in the morning, what happens is my consciousness becomes the kind of focal consciousness that we are aware of. So we have the trouble with talking about consciousness is it has a number of meanings. One is what you don't have when you are on the operating table. Another is what you don't have, I imagine, when you're dead, unless you believe that the spirit carries on, and perfectly reasonable, intelligent people do believe that. And in a sort of way, I believe that too. But what is the consciousness we're talking about is the bit that is in our focus. So we're aware of being conscious. I'm aware of the things that my consciousness is focused on. But my consciousness is also taking in many, many other things that I'm not aware of. And we call that unconscious. But it's still very much part of me, part of my thinking, part of what helps make me the person I am and make the decisions I make, and so forth. And then we could come to the question of what the relationship is between my consciousness and a more broad field of consciousness. So first of all, I am what Whitehead called a pan-experientialist. In other words, I believe that everything in the cosmos in some form experiences. And that is not as irrational as it sounds. In my view, it is actually the most reasonable alternative. Nobody has found any way that is remotely convincing after hundreds of years of attempts to explain how consciousness comes out of lumpen matter. That's if matter has nothing to do with consciousness. But I think that matter must have something innately to do with consciousness. Otherwise, we're just talking about a magic trick. And so everywhere there is a field of consciousness, and everything that exists within consciousness, and consciousness within it. So that is my take on pan-experientialism. So why do I have a limited circumscribed consciousness? Why do I have my experience of what I feel is mine and not what you feel is yours? And I think the answer to that is that, going back to my thesis, that everything is unfolding into differentiatedness, but is never actually completely severed from everything else, so that it doesn't impair the integrity of the whole. I believe that we are like a whirlpool in a stream that is not in the stream in the way a ball would be in the stream, but because the whirlpool is the stream for that moment where it is. And it's perfectly real. You can photograph it, you can measure it, has power to move stones. It's perfectly real. But the water flows through it and on and away. And eventually the whirlpool itself also will move away. And I think we are rather like that. We are diffusely connected, but we have an entity that is bounded. Another useful for me metaphor, and then I'll stop talking, I promise you, Jim, is that of a cell which has an irregular boundary. The cell membrane has outpouchings in it. And you can imagine, if you like, situating something, a conscious entity, inside that cytoplasm within an outpouching. And it would look all around and it would think it was enclosed on all sides. And in a certain sense it was. But actually, if it looked towards the root, the foot of the outpouching, it would see that it was in connection with the cytoplasm of the whole cell. So there's a few thoughts. I'll pick them apart.
Very interesting. I love the, I would call it reference to Heraclitus with the stream and the whirlpool. I often use the whirlpool analogy on the nature of human life and death, that a whirlpool is a little formation of negative entropy, just as life is. Life is a far more intricate one. And it lasts for a while, and then when the cycles that hold it together dissipate, the structure of negative entropy dissipates, and our chemistry goes back into the ground to be recycled in some other fashion. So I found both of those analogies quite interesting. On the idea of resistance, I'm going to suggest a related way to look at that. Alicia Huaro, who's been on the show and somebody whose books I read a fair bit, a philosopher of emergence, amongst other things, she frames her emergence around constraints, that the upper layers of an emergent being or structure or system are essentially pruned by constraints that have been built up by the actual lower level functions of the pieces that are emergent, and you need something like resistance to have constraint. So I would say that your perspective of constraint is closely related to the idea of resistance, and that those are actually quite interesting. I was curious whether your ideas about what you might call panpsychism are related to Philip Goff's ideas, who's a philosopher of consciousness. In fact, he'll be on our show next month, and we're going to talk about panpsychism. He argues that even fundamental particles, quarks, have consciousness, and all that. And I guess those are some of my major reactions. And I guess then the question I have pushing them, you can address all of them. And then the question, sort of a little bit more open at, is to take this idea of consciousness in a single membrane, a cell, and then how does that scale up to something like the consciousness in a biological person? So it's a lot of different things. Hit the ones you want to hit.
Okay. Well, first of all, delighted to hear you having Ferb on the show. He's a friend of mine, and we've talked together in the flesh, in public, and we do very largely see a similar picture. Yes, and emergence is a very important aspect of the philosophy that I hold. If I can pompously say so, I'm a process philosopher. I'm in the history, the stream of history of Whitehead and others. And those analogies, of the whirlpool and so on are timeless. They're there, yes, in Heraclitus, and they're there in Schelling in the early 19th century, and who I'm, again, particularly fond of. So all those threads are right. Now, how does the resistance scale up? I think I know what you're getting at. I think the very important point to make is that whatever it is that is going on in a cell is not related to what is going on in the whole person by addition or summation of lots of little cells doing those things. So I don't hold that anything actually in the universe is simply additive. It is more to do with fields of relationship which alter the nature of the parts that are within it, and that they take part in a whole that has certain characteristics. I'm fond of using the German word Gestalt, because we don't have a proper word for this, which really just refers to a whole that is not just the sum of the parts. And I think that the things that truly exist have this Gestalt nature, and that they can be seen as nested. In this, they are like, I don't know if you've ever seen, or your viewers have ever seen, a rather fabulous clip which is available on the internet, which starts from outer space and comes in eventually to the Earth, and then goes in eventually to a town, and then goes in eventually to a park where there are a couple sitting, I think, on the grass, and goes right down into the glass, and then goes further and further down. So these levels of scale are nested in that way. They don't get added together or anything. They just depend on a different place of observation, a different point of view. And that is not as trivial as it sounds, since I believe that the way in which we pay attention to the world changes what we find. I'm quite well known for this view that attention changes the world. And so I think that is the point I'd make there. And it's not unlike a fractal image. In fact, what I just described is in fact a kind of fractal image, in which, except that in the fractal image you see the same pattern at every stage where you go down. And it could be argued that you do also see that broadly, philosophically, at all the levels, from the very largest to the very smallest.
Yeah, very interesting. And I would say not far from my own views. I call it, with a few other people, emergent naturalism. I would say one of the most well-known proponents is Larry Cahoon, who's been on the show. He's a philosopher of emergence, and my original mentor in complexity science, when I retired from business and decided to become a complexitarian, Harold Morowitz, has written a book called The Emergence of Everything, where he talks about 28 nested emergences from the Big Bang to, and his last one is I think spirituality, but it includes things like economics, society. Quite interesting. So, and I do think you hit on all the key parts, that these things are wholes that transcend their components, right? The example I give is you take up my hefty carcass and pour all the chemicals broken down into a 55-gallon drum. Extremely unlikely those chemicals are going to jump out of the barrel, walk down the street, and buy a 6-pack of beer on a hot summer day. But me, I'm quite likely to do that, right? So and it's just a fundamental different level of operation that the raw chemicals in the barrel can't even conceptualize if they have a panpsychic consciousness of some sort. It's very low level and is not going to consider it wants a beer and it can walk down the street. And so, I think that those things are all actually quite congruent in how we think about the world.
Yes, I discovered a retired physicist called Abramovitz, I think, Mike Abramovitz. I'm trying to think back to a few years ago, anyway, who makes an interesting point about the difference between what he calls architective form and I think what he calls continuous or connective form. But in any case, this idea that there can be at different phases a play between two things that are needed. One is to have more of a structure that is discontinuous, has discontinuities in it, and one that is a structure in which those discontinuities are overridden. And I think that you can find that at all levels of description. But what intrigues me is that some physicists state quite clearly that although there are things that are described, like the Planck length, which is supposed to be, as it were, a discontinuous building block of both time and space, in fact, continuity overrides that, and I'm really here piggybacking on the work of David Tong, who's professor of physics at Cambridge, and he says pretty uncompromisingly, I see no evidence for discontinuity. The cosmos is continuous.
That's an open question. I mean, this is an area I study fairly closely, and whether the Planck range is a real granularity or if it's all continuous and the Planck phenomena is an artifact of our mathematics, I would say is unknown and unlikely to be known for a very long time, because the distance from, let's say, a quark to the Planck length is greater in orders of magnitude than from the quark to the whole universe. So the Planck length is very, very far down. So I'm going to remain agnostic on whether the universe is continuous or not at that level. The guy's name is Tom, what was his last name?
Tong, T-O-N-G.
T-O-N-G. I have to take a look, see what his argument is. It sounds like he's quite emphatic that it is continuous. I'd like to see what that argument is. I would say that is not a majority view at this time.
If you have a handy copy of The Matter with Things in your pocket, as it were, you can search for Tong. And
okay, I will do that. I do have my Kindle version up someplace.
Well, there you are, and I give, as you would expect, all the references. So there you go.
Okay, ask another question. We talk about consciousness, and this is an area that I do some work in. I'm the chairman emeritus of the California Institute for Machine Consciousness, which has gotten me back into thinking about consciousness in a very functionalist and detailed fashion. And one of the things I have found talking to many consciousness scientists is that there is I believe, unfortunate tendency to be overly human-centered in our thinking and our examples. What's your thought about the differences, if any, between the consciousness of a human and a chimp or a dog?
Well, I think they have very much in common. In fact, if they only had speech, which is not an intrinsic necessity for consciousness, we'd probably find that there was much greater similarity than we think. I mean, certainly chimps and humans, I mean, not only do they very, very much share DNA, 99 point whatever it is %, but they also show pretty much all the aspects of consciousness that we're familiar with. Obviously, you cannot exhibit without speech an understanding of spirit or soul or whatever you like to call it. But failing that, they can exhibit value-laden behavior. They will behave in ways which show that they have empathy, some horrible experiments which I don't think would get approval now, but were done back in the 50s and 60s, put a chimpanzee or another of the great apes in a cage next to another of his species, and the only way he could get food was by shocking the chimpanzee in the other cage. And as soon as he realized very quickly that this is what was happening, he would rather starve himself for days than give this shock to the other chimpanzee. So and dogs are notoriously affectionate, self-denying, often in a similar way, when they think something's at stake, and they will rescue others of their species at risk of their own lives. And many animals actually will rescue even a creature of another species. So it's not just, a kin-related thing. So I think their consciousness is probably remarkably like ours. And some staggering things are also known about the consciousness of corvids, probably the most intelligent group of birds. But some of them can do mathematical calculations at the same level that a 9-year-old human child would be able to do it. They can remember a single face after one exposure a couple of years later and know the right behavior to adopt in response to that face. So, you can put in more and more of these elements, but I think it's wrong to deny consciousness to any living creature.
I often use that as an example when someone throws out some comment about consciousness. I will say, "Is that true for a dog?" And they'll stop and think about it. And go, "Ooh, yeah." And that's a really interesting little probe question, because there are some attributes of our consciousnesses which are different, and you hit on probably the biggest one, which is language. Right? We have. My view on it, at least, is we have conscious contents floating around in our brain, images, sounds, smells, whatever, that are part of our sensorium. I would argue dogs and chimps have a sensorium similar, probably all the way back to amphibians, with lesser and lesser detail. And once we become humans, words become part of our sensoriums, or at least at the intersection between words and thought. And of course, that's still a fraught field for philosophers. What is the difference between human thought and human language? That's probably the principal difference, as far as I can tell.
Yes, it is. And having language is instrumentally incredibly useful and a big advance, but it is also can present an obstacle. So we sometimes feel that unless we've been able to express it in language satisfactorily, we haven't understood it, or it doesn't exist. And I'm skeptical about that. I think there are many things, probably the most important things, that defy any more than a perfunctory expression in language, and that their meaning and nature goes far, far beyond anything that can be so circumscribed.
Yeah, I like John Vervaeke's formulation is 4 Ps. 2 of them are at one end propositional, the other participatory, right? Propositional might be somebody's clinical write-up of what sex is like, or what sex is, or how it works. And the other is the actual thing itself, right? And the actual thing itself is vastly higher dimensional than any write-up might be. And that if we overly fixate on the propositional, we're missing most of what makes life interesting.
Indeed. And 2 things there, really. And one is participatory. I think that is essential to my view of the world, that everything that we experience, we are part of what happens, and something other than us is part of what happens. And those 2 elements participate together in absolutely everything. And the fact that we take part in it doesn't make it less real. It, in fact, ensures that it is real. And here we're thinking, both of us, I imagine, of John Archibald Wheeler's expression, this is a participatory universe. But on the Vervaeke point, yes, I make another point which I think is sort of parallel but illuminates something slightly different, which is the difference between what can be explicit and what is implicit. And that by making something explicit, our left hemispheric understanding of the world says we have got closer to it and made it clearer what it is. Whereas the right hemisphere would say that by making it fully explicit, we have denatured it and actually moved further away from what it really is. And examples would be all the things that really matter to us. You've mentioned one, sex, but also love and friendship and religious faith, poetry, music, architecture, art, myth, ritual, narrative. All these things can be a hatchet job could be done on them by trying to reduce them to a formula in words that is decontextualized. And it always is an act of diminution or destruction, I'm afraid.
And of course, you're quite famous for your work on how the left brain and the right brain, and you alluded to it in passing, but even though I said we're not going to go into your works and artifacts, I'm going to do it anyway. Maybe give us a couple of minutes on how the left and right hemisphere, in your view, parse the world, and particularly how they've come to parse the world in the modern world in a way which may be suboptimal.
Yes, I mean, it would probably be a bit of a distraction for me to give a proper, intro to the thinking for those who don't know, but I suspect quite a few people will have some idea of it. I mean, effectively, the things that used to be said about hemisphere differences are wrong. That's the first point. But there clearly are hemisphere differences. The first puzzle for me in training as a doctor was, why is the brain divided at all? It would surely be more beneficial for it to have connections across everywhere. I mean, its power is in the number of connections it can make. So why decrease them? Why are the 2 hemispheres asymmetrical, both functionally and structurally? And why is the corpus callosum, the rather tenuous band of fibers at the base of these 2 hemispheres, which conducts impulses from one hemisphere to the other, why is it so much concerned with inhibition? A lot of its activity, probably the majority of it, is saying, this is what's going on and I'm dealing with it, don't you get involved? All those questions got me interested in what these differences really were, and they're not what people used to say. They got them wrong, partly because they asked the machine question, what does each hemisphere do? Because that's what interests you in a machine. But they're not machines, they're parts of a person, actually. And what interests human beings about things is, how do they get hold of this? In what way do they deal with this? What approach do they adopt? Because that will change what is there. And the 2 hemispheres attend to the world in different ways. This has an evolutionary basis because every creature has to be able to focus narrowly on a single simple object that it knows that it needs, usually to eat, or to manipulate in some way in order to get purchase on the world, perhaps to pick up a twig to build a nest or whatever. But basically, all creatures need to focus on food. They need to be targeted on stuff they're going to get. And for that, their attention has to be very pinpointed on a particular thing that is already known and familiar, and that's what you want, and you get it. But if you only pay that attention, then you soon become somebody else's lunch while you're getting your own, because you don't see the predator, you don't see your mate, you don't see your kin. You're supposed to be looking out for them as well. And it's so difficult is this for one neuronal mass to do at the same time, that the answer was to split the work so that one half of the brain, and it's principally the left half of the brain, does the utilitarian thing of grabbing and getting things, and that is really its only value, whereas the right hemisphere does everything else. It has a whole lot of other values, and it is seeing the whole picture. Now, why this matters is that it gives rise experientially to two different kinds of world. So what are they like? The left hemisphere's world is made up of bits that are familiar, known, useful, easily identified, obvious. What the left hemisphere sees is what's on the tin, and it sees these things as decontextualized, abstract, and generic in nature. Whereas the right hemisphere sees a world in which nothing is ever completely fixed and known, in which everything is interconnected with everything else, ultimately, in which what actually surrounds the focus of your interest and your attention makes a big difference. The context is very important. And the implicit, as I mentioned, is something the right hemisphere understands, but the left doesn't. So the right hemisphere understands jokes, it understands metaphor, it understands stories and myths. The left hemisphere takes everything with a sort of deadly literal kind of thinking, such as a computer would make of it if you fed in the English dictionary and a guide to syntax. So they're very different. And one of these worlds, that of the left hemisphere, is mechanical, can be reduced to its parts without loss, and is effectively inanimate. And I mean literally that. So, when people have damage to the right hemisphere, they take living beings, people, their wives, husbands, to be machines or zombies of some kind. Whereas with the left hemisphere inactivated and only the right hemisphere, they may go the other way and, for example, see the sun as obviously a living object. It gives out a great deal of warmth, it encourages life, and it moves across the heavens and so forth. So those are the main differences. And a couple of other small things that, just to finish off, that I need to mention. One is that the left hemisphere is an inveterate optimist, and the right hemisphere is more of a realist. And the left hemisphere is concerned only with representations, whereas the right hemisphere sees the real thing that is represented by the left hemisphere. To the right hemisphere, whatever it is, presences. It really is there. It is coming into being for them. Whereas the left hemisphere deals with representations, which is a funny word because it means present again after it's no longer actually present. And we now live so much in that world that I believe we're living in a sort of false imitation of the world, a plan, a map, a schema, a diagram, a theory about things, rather than what our experience brings to us in a live way. So that's it, really. And I mean, I think that what I see around me is the effects of dominance of this left hemisphere view. It's interesting that the left hemisphere view is actually deficient. I mean, in the old days, it seemed like the left hemisphere was the wise guy and the one that you really ought to put your money on. But we now know that it's very much the other way around, that the right hemisphere not only obviously attends to more of the world than the left, made that clear, but actually also perceives things, which is not the same thing, in all modalities better than the left hemisphere. It makes better judgments on what it has seen or perceived or experienced. The left hemisphere tends to become deluded very rapidly, whereas the right hemisphere is much more grounded in reality. The left hemisphere is less intelligent, not just emotionally and socially, which it's long been known to be, but as is now clear, less intelligent cognitively than the right hemisphere. IQ is much more dependent on the right hemisphere. So all in all, living in a world dominated by the relatively stupid left hemisphere is not a very good plan, which may explain why we're going to hell in a handcart right now, because we believe that the hemisphere that tells us how to become rich and powerful is the one to listen to. But if we really want to increase our power, we have to very, very quickly, and we can't do this quickly, increase our wisdom, because otherwise what we're doing is we're putting something like machine guns in the hands of toddlers.
Indeed, we're driving over the cliff on a system that has no brakes, basically, right? And I have liked this diagnosis, quite useful. So let's get back. We're going to take a movement from here, which is actually not a bad or too discontinuous a movement, back to our theme of worldviews, which is, in your perspective, what is the relationship between our brains, our consciousnesses, both hemispheres, and actual reality? This is an old question, of course, but I'd love to get your perspective. I'd love to get your perspective on that.
Well, first of all, I resist either a naive idealist or naive realist explanation. So the naive idealist model is that effectively what we experience is just made up by us, as if somehow what exists apart from us played very little part in it, or any part at all. And the naive realist position is the other extreme, that there just is a reality out there that is independent of our seeking it or our observing it, and that our job is to register it in the most detached and therefore apparently real way in order to get a handle on it. So I deal with both of those rather quickly in the matter with things. I don't hold either of them. So what do I hold? I hold that everything that we know is an encounter. So every single thing, every entity, every experience, every feeling, every whatever is an encounter. What? Between whatever is in me and capable of awareness, and in what is outside of me and capable of being perceived, received, attended to. This might be compatible with the position of Donald Hoffman, but he and I had a conversation, a very amicable conversation, recently, which is up on the internet, and I think we do slightly differ. He tends to suggest, well, more than suggest, he does actually use this analogy that, as it were, it's as if we were in a cell that has no access to the world except through dials, and we're reading off from the dials, and these dials give rise to our experience, as though nothing in the real world could be at all like what we experience. It just has a purely structural, data-driven relationship. Information comes in, and we happen to construe it in a certain way. Now, of course, how we see things depends on who we are and the circumstances and so on. So I'm not suggesting that whatever it is we see is the fullness of reality, but it is at least in touch with reality. It is partial knowledge of reality, But the partial nature of it is not that it only goes part way to reality and then has to stop because there's a great big wall, but that it is partial in the sense that it is the bit of reality that I can see, the bit of reality you can see. And again, Whitehead made the point, a very good one, that though science can tell us that when we see a sunset, we see a light with a certain wavelength being emitted and all the rest, perfectly true. But it says that science is not entitled to say that the experience of the sunset, the redness of it and all that that means to us is not real. And I would strongly agree with that.
Very good. Yeah, I make the same point that what is real? I mean, whatever is in the universe is real. And so a sense of redness is real, right? Now, we can't yet explain it, the famous hard problem, but it must be real because it's in the universe. Now, it may be that, it's in fact, in my view, it's part of the machinery of how we interpret the universe. There is a universe out there, in my view, but then there is our processed perceptions, which produce our model of what's in the universe. And I'm a strong believer that evolution is the most powerful force in the history of emergences since life began, and that our representations must not be terrible, because there's clearly going to be a reproductive advantage to having your perceptions of reality be good enough, right? So there's a reason that seeing the red is useful, and so it's probably not too far away. And I still remember my first thinking about this problem was like in second grade. I asked our teacher, "Now, is your way of seeing red the same as my seeing red?" And she basically just said, "Shut up, fears," you basically. But
yeah.
But I never forgot the question. All right, let's move on.
No. I agree with you. That's right. I mean, the only thing I'd say before we move on, Jim, is that we do have to take into account that we can be mistaken. So some perceptions are more real than others. I've spent a lot of my life consorting with people whose way of thinking about the world is pretty mistaken. And so it's not that all our perceptions are right, or all our intuitions are right, or all our reasoning is right. We can be deceived by anything. So that has to be put into the mix. Some things are realer than others, I think.
Yeah, certainly. For instance, some of the classic optical illusions that the psychology lab guys run, the perceptions and the mental models of things that we see are real, but they are not congruent representations with the closer physical reality. The famous dots that suddenly appear on a grid, even though there are no dots there. Are the dots real? The dots are real inside your perceptive scheme, but if someone takes a picture of them and shows them to somebody else, the grids, there aren't any dots, right? If you change the resolution a little bit. So yeah, these are all deep and interesting questions. But let's now move. We could spend 2 hours just talking about that one topic, right? Let's go on and move on to another component, which I think it's somewhat an interesting probe on Whitehead and friends, and that is, for almost all of us, except serious artists, we are, I think, obligate objectifiers. When we look at the world, pre-processed deep in our unconscious, the world is created as objects, right? We don't see just a raster of colors and dots and stuff, even though that's what's actually in our retina. It's presented to us as that door behind me, your head, your glasses, and it's really hard for us to not see the world as objects. As I said, some great artists could do it, but mostly the world is presented to us by our conscious cognition as objects. And further, the objects typically have parts. My nose, when I look at it as an object here on the screen, has got eyes, nose. My head, I have eyes, nose, mouth, chin, etc. And we tend to have relatively similar ways of deconstructing objects. So, talk to me a little bit about what are objects as we perceive them, and how do they relate, if at all, to reality?
Well, I wouldn't wish to deny objects their reality. Of course, they are a way of seeing the world, a world constituted by objects. But I hold that prior to things, objects, are relations. I argue that actually the relations come first, and that you can't actually know what a thing is until you see what it is in relation to. It takes its nature from its relations to other things. And so initially there is a network, and I see things as what stand forward against that field. So we see a field of vision, a field of stimuli, and so on. And out of that field, certain things seem to almost immediately come clear to us. And they do so partly by a degree of creativity on our part, in which we know familiarly how they do that. So from a purely perceptual level, at a purely perceptual level, it's not difficult to see what it is we mean by things. But at a deeper philosophical level, I think it becomes problematic. I think that my understanding of physics is that, again, what is depends on the relationships that are held between particles, however small you want to go. You don't see what is there until if you go down in your level of observation to a much lower level of magnification, and so on, or high level of magnification, you will find relationships are what create what is there. And I like this image, which derives from the Vedanta of, and forgive me if I've mentioned this before, but I like it very much. There is a god, an Indian god called Indra, and Indra casts a net over the universe. And what is a net? A net is just many filaments, many connectors that just connect, and nothing comes about until they cross. And where they cross in this net, there is suspended a jewel at each crossing point, and in each jewel, all the other jewels in the net are reflected or visible. So I like that, because it brings together a number of elements about my vision of reality.
Interesting. Now, a relationship, to be interesting, is probably in most cases dynamic, right? That even quarks move around with respect to each other, and things happen in electron orbitals. The relationships are probably never static. Now, when you come into movement, then comes forth two related questions: movement relative to what, and movement caused how. And I guess I would call those two the question of time and causality. What are your thoughts on those two minor little uninteresting things?
Well, again, how long do we have? But I think I can be relatively succinct about it. I think you're right that nothing exists that is not in motion, and the difficulty with doing away with either time or space is that motion becomes impossible. But motion is the primary thing that we find in the cosmos. Motion of what? And I'm like Lee Smolin, who wrote a book called, I think, The Rebirth of Time, in which he argues that although a number of his colleagues like to say that time is an illusion, time is one of the things, probably the only thing about which you can say it just cannot be an illusion. And even for the arrow of time to go in the other direction would make a nonsense of most mathematics and physics, and that we need to have this idea of causality to make sense of the world. However, I think that once you come to causality itself rather than time, you need to be able to have, I mean, it's not very difficult, more sophisticated models of causality than a simply linear one. So this is really the difference between a machine and an organism. And one of the reasons that an organism is very much harder to predict than a machine is that the elements in it are not clearly defined. They're interacting with one another sometimes in 10,000 ways in a second. And all those paths interact with one another, so that an organism is not just practically impossible to predict, but is intrinsically impossible to predict. So I think that's what I'd say as a starter anyway, Jim.
Right. Yeah, we actually had Lee Smolin on in one of my very first episodes, EP5, and the title was something like "Time is Real, Space is an Illusion," and we got into Lee's concepts of time a fair bit, and it's become one of my interested topics. Recently had Sarah Walker and Lee Cronin on, where we talked about their assembly theory, and one of their key moves is to attack the so-called block universe that a lot of physicists argue that most physics is time reversible. And so time must be fake, right? There is no real time. It all exists simultaneously. And these guys, but I go back to my emergentist perspective, and Sarah and Lee have formalized this with respect to chemistry, that there are certain things that can't happen unless a long period of time has gone by, right? For instance, the emergence of life or the emergence of very large organic molecules. So how could it all exist at the same time? It makes no sense. And I will say I've come to accept that view as a pretty interesting one. And so then, the Smolin perspective that something like synchronous time at some level must exist, maybe, Lee would argue, even below Einsteinian relativity time. He believes there's a fixed clock to the universe. I'm not sure I'll go that far, but it is certainly a key question when we ask about what is one's worldview. How does one think about time?
Yeah. And I think that as it were, even God can't do away with time. I think there is a book called something like that. But so I think it's a very important element of one's picture is this idea of things evolving and becoming. And what are evolving and becoming if there is no time? They don't make any sense. I for what it's worth, take the view of what's called a growing block. So not a block universe and not a sliced universe, or just made up of slices, but that there is a block and it's constantly expanding, and that where we are is always on the edge of this expanding sphere.
Yeah, I can accept that, I suppose, though, of course, it implies the possibility of backward travel in time, which then we end up, killing our grown great-grandfather and all that sort of stuff.
Well, it can be just a block that grows, not one that shrinks, but there we are. Yeah.
Okay. I'll have to look into that. That's one I'm not familiar with. All right, let's move on to another very important topic and how each of us has to confront the world. To you, where do values come from? And sort of the basis for ethics and right behavior.
Absolutely spot on question. I mean, I didn't know when I wrote that book which the matter with things I'm talking about, which has the structure, part 1, neuropsychology. How does the brain shape our reality? Part 2, epistemology. How do we make progress towards whatever is true? And I reckon it's science, reason, imagination, and intuition. But in the last part of the book, so with what we've gathered from the first part of the book, what does the cosmos look like? And I knew there'd be chapters on things like the coincidence of opposites and time and flow and space and matter and consciousness. I didn't know that I was going to have 2 separate chapters on values and purpose, and another one on I did know I was going to have this one, the sense of the sacred, and the sacred, of course, is another value. And I consider values to be at the core of our misery at the moment, that we have disengaged from values. We've mistaken the nature of values. We think they're simply our preferences, whereas I believe there is no way in which values can be derived from a valueless cosmos. It's slightly like the idea that consciousness is an ontological primitive. Without there being values, things that can be valued cannot exist. And we are the valuers. We are the great valuers. I think the higher animals together value things, certainly appreciate beauty in certain ways. And in essence, I've already mentioned that they have an idea of goodness as well. And so these things are fundamental. Now, there needs to be a distinction between value and values. So values may be what we in 2026 happen to value in Western Europe or America or wherever it is. That's another question from whether there is value at the start of things, and there is, in my view. So I think they're ontological primitives, and I think one of the ways of explaining the existence of life, which is a bit of a conundrum, is that in order to value, there need to be these fabulously energy-consuming, profligate, extravagant creatures who are capable of responding, reciprocating, resonating with what is in the cosmic origin. And part of that is the evolution, in other words, the evolving, but the literal sort of unfolding outwards of value. I take the view that what's going on, what is the ground of being, whatever you like to call it, and whatever its nature, is exploring its own nature by precipitating out into actuality parts of a field of potential. And to do that, it needs something other that can respond to it. And I believe we're in that reciprocal role with whatever you like to call it. People can call it God, or they can call it Logos or Li, or whatever they want. But whatever it is, it and living creatures, particularly and extravagantly, mostly human beings, are capable of returning and increasing those values, or if they choose to, diminishing them and destroying them. So that is what we're here for, in my view. It's not a small point.
Yeah, not at all. Now, this gets to another classic big worldview question. How do you think about that, right? In terms of, does the universe have a teleology, a place that it's going, and is the emergence of something that is able to perceive value part of a teleology, or is it a frozen accident that just happened?
No, I think there is such a thing as teleology. But one needs to make an important distinction. People rightly dislike the idea of a teleology that involves determinism, so that there is a foreknown goal, and all along that is it, and things just move towards that goal, which would be, no more interesting than letting go of a toy train on a track where it kind of automatically runs down the track and goes to the buffers. I don't think that is the nature of the cosmos. I don't think that the telos is in that sense fixed. It is not a known location, as it were. It is instead a lure from in front that conscious beings and valuing beings such as ourselves can be lured by towards something. But what actually happens in the end is not just unknown because we don't yet know enough, but is intrinsically unknowable. So it doesn't. My vision of a telos doesn't involve a God that is an engineer who's already fixed it so that it will come out like this, as it were. But he has, as it were, created a landscape which will mean that things will tend to flow in a certain direction. There I'm referring to Conrad Hal Waddington's idea of what he called creodes, which is the idea there is a landscape that has folds in it, and the water falls on the landscape at random. And yet has general, and particular particles of water can go anywhere they like. But overall, there are tendencies built into the landscape for the water to go down certain channels we call streams, then rivers, and into the sea.
Yeah, that's an interesting analogy. I am very agnostic about the teleology versus not question yet, but maybe one day we'll find out. That's certainly an attractive version of the tale. Now, you mentioned before that we can either go with value or go against value, right? And one might think of sin, perhaps, as going against value. I think that's not an insane fabrication. Where do you think we are today as a civilization with respect to going with value or going against value?
Well, I think we radically misunderstand who we are and what we're doing here, what the world is, and what our lives are about. I don't think we have the faintest idea. And of course, it's very good that we shouldn't have dogmatically fixed ideas, but it's not good for anybody or anything for us to be drifting around in a hopeless daze, not knowing what to think. So I think there are elements in our thought that are counterproductive. Some of them are very obvious. There are things like me, me, me. Egotism is neither leads to personal happiness nor to the happiness and high functioning of a society. We need to be more aware of our relationships to one another and more embedded in them. So we know that there are three things that make for a fulfilled human life, and there's a vast literature on this, a lot of which I detail at the end of the Matter with Things, and they are our relationships to a coherent social group, a sense of belonging to people that you can trust, who share your values, who will help you and you help them, and you may eat together and you may pray together and so forth. And that is enormously grounding. It's very good for health of the psyche, health of the body, actually, as well, interestingly, but importantly, health of a civilization. And the second is a sense of belonging in nature, not being surrounded by something called the environment, which seems like a detached entity, but by nature. We come out of nature. We are born out of nature, which is, after all, what nature really means. And we go back into nature. And so I think we've lost our sense of belonging in nature as well. And I think the third thing we've lost is a sense of belonging in the cosmos, because we think it's all just stuff bumping into other stuff without any meaning, direction, or purpose. And my reason for writing The Matter with Things was to take the reader through I think, persuasive, scientifically based and rational argument that vision is extraordinarily unlikely, that we are missing important elements in the picture, and as a result we're committing suicide. We're committing suicide as a society, as a civilization, and I mean that in the sense that, there is a very high risk, as we're all aware, that society will collapse, either as a result of things we've done to the natural world, and which is our home, or because of the advent of AI. And I'm afraid I put my money even more on AI than the frightful things that we've done to the environment. The world could eventually recover from that, but I don't think it can ever recover from AI.
I put another one out there in the work I do in the Game B field, which is the breakdown of our collective sense-making. I point out that in 1965, when I was old enough to sort of I'm old. I understand. I understood the world at least a bit. I was 12 in 1965. In that year,
You're the same age as me.
Yeah, I think we discovered that at one point. I remember that.
Okay, you're right.
Both born in 53, I think, right? And yeah. At that time, less than 50% of adult Americans had high school educations, and 9% had 4-year college degrees, right? And yet our politics was not too insane in 1965. And then today we have 85 or 90% supposedly high school grads, 35% 4-year college grads. And at least from my perspective, our politics is utterly insane, right? Both sides, so-called, both completely disconnected from reality and are both involved in driving us over the cliff. And how could this be? We have all these ways to communicate. Every known thing is on the internet. I often think back when I was in 1965, I would have loved to have access to Google Scholar, for instance. Holy moly. And yet we can't think at all, it appears. So breakdown of collective sense-making may actually be the thing that bites us in the ass before either climate change or AI, though AI is coming on pretty...
Well, you might say that a breakdown in collective sense-making and shared values and an understanding is why we have those major crises. And I wholly agree with that. And, of course, what it illustrates is that information has nothing whatever to do with intelligence or wisdom. I make distinctions between information, different kinds of knowing, understanding, and wisdom. And we don't even reach first base. Well, we have information, but we can't take it anywhere useful, it seems. When you look at the kind of level of discourse in politics, in public, the caliber of people who are our politicians, and look back 50 years, 100 years, and look at the way in which politicians spoke and debated with one another, and they weren't saints, of course, and people can be corrupt. But that's not my point. My point is that things were going on at a far higher intellectual level. And the worst thing now is I'm afraid, any attempt to communicate on a serious matter in social media. It will just be, in a very left hemisphere way, of course, because what the left hemisphere wants is it's either this or it's that. It can't. What do you mean it can be both? Or it might be either, or it depends on the context. No, you're just wrong, and and you're a Nazi or whatever. I mean, the level of it's 5 or 6 years old. I think we're more able to carry on a civilized conversation than people seem to be able to do nowadays. It's incredible. Anyway, there we are.
When we talk about the people, I often make the example when, in being an American, of course, I'm obsessed with the founders and the founding, right? I go in 1789, when the Constitution came into effect, the population of the United States was 3.5 million. And our leaders were people like George Washington, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Ben Franklin, the George Mason, the Morrises. I mean, these were absolutely first-class people. And now we got Donald Trump and Marjorie Taylor Greene. What the fuck, right? And we have 330 million people to select from. 100 times as many.
Yeah, I learned recently a saying of John Adams, which struck me very forcibly as wise, which was, yes, we have this system we call democracy, and we have great hopes of it, but it won't survive if people don't maintain moral probity. And that, it sounds terribly old-fashioned, but hey, those old-fashioned guys, they have wisdom and insight. And we need that moral probity back again.
All righty. I think that's a good place to wrap it up. Iain McGilchrist, thank you very much for a wonderfully interesting, in-depth exploration of your worldviews.
Thank you very much, Jim, for putting up with it.
It really was great. You can come back anytime.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
The Jim Rutt Show is produced by Andrew Blevins. Audio and video edited by Stephen Lowe. Music by Tom Muller at modernspacemusic.com.